Thank you for coming. It's always a challenge to get people to focus in on the content of seminars and workshops when there's so much else going on, chef demos and trade show to see and all this. So we appreciate you being the stalwart few deeply dedicated to education and learning. In the long run, you'll see you will triumph. But I'm very happy to be able to have a little conversation here today with Tim York. Tim York is really a legend in the American produce industry. He's been CEO of our major national trade association. He has been chairman, I should say, of our major national trade association. He's led initiative after initiative in food safety, in sustainability, and continues in important roles today. He has been involved in a innovative company, which I'll let him detail what exactly they do, but has now had a quarter century plus of uniting the food service industry. So we're going to have a little conversation that's going to focus on some key food service issue. So, the thing about food service, it's a very funny part of the business. On the one hand, what's really fantastic about food service, if you take a look, there are very few things that we have 100 years of good data on. But one thing we have 100 years of good data on in America is the percentage of consumer dollars, food dollars, that are spent in food service or out of home eating as opposed to retail or in-home eating. And for 100 years, the trend has been steady that the percentage of food dollars that are going to food service rather than retail has been increasing. And it has now reached the point where over 50% of consumer food dollars are being spent on food service. Now this is dollars, it's not food volume. So when you're eating at a restaurant, you pay more because you're buying service and atmosphere and things like this. But our best estimates are that somewhere around 25% of the volume of fresh produce is being sold through food service. It's not felt equally throughout the industry because there's certain products that food service tends to concentrate on. But if you were investing money today and wanted to invest in where the industry was going to be in the future, well, we have 100 years of data telling you that the future, if it's anything like the last 100 years, is going to be more and more people eating outside the home. And the truth is, even a lot of retail business today, although technically classified as retail because it gets rung up into the supermarket, it's restaurants in those retailers. Therefore, this is a really important area to take account of. And it has special issues. It poses big challenges. How do you do branding in an area where the brand will get lost and subsumed in bigger products? How do you make sure that you get premiums for certain varieties when in fact the consumer doesn't know they're getting those varieties? How do you ensure food safety when you have this whole other area of often not highly paid workers in kitchens who are not highly trained necessarily? And how do we make sure that all the good work that growers, shippers, packers do, spending millions and millions and millions of euros to make sure that they're meeting the highest food safety standards, is actually not undone by activities in the kitchen? So there's a lot to go over, and I'm going to let Tim introduce himself a little bit more, and he's prepared a few slides to sort of get our conversation going, and then we can have a great discussion about these issues.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me okay? Great.
Are you hearing, Tim?
Great, thank you. As Jim said, I'm Tim York. I'm the president of Markon Cooperative. We're based in Salinas, California. And so what you'll hear me talk about today is about what's happening in food service within the U.S. I'm no expert. In fact, I know very little about European food service, but hopefully there can be some learnings for you from what we take away from what's happening in the States. Markon Cooperative is a organization of 7 privately owned, family-owned businesses, multi-generational. They are what we would call broadline distributors in food service. So they are carrying virtually everything that you would need for a restaurant, starting from the tables and chairs, the equipment, the stoves, down to the fluid milk, the fresh meats and produce, paper towels in the restroom, virtually everything that you would need. If you had an empty building and wanted to build a restaurant, we could provide you everything for that building. So that's the business that our distributors are in. We ship to 78 different locations in the US and Canada. The services that Markon provides is in the area of fresh produce, fruits and vegetables, fresh only. And we, first off, do purchasing, so we're leveraging purchasing among these 7 different companies. We're doing branding for them. Jim talked about branding. We can expand on that conversation a bit later. We conduct food safety. We conduct in-field quality assurance. We're also doing logistics work for them, marketing, support, obviously social media, websites, that kind of thing. So a number of value-added services. So what I thought I'd do, as Jim said, was get us started this morning to talk about some of the trends that I see happening in food service, some of the data around that, and then and Jim, feel free, or if you in the audience have any questions, feel free to holler at us, and we'll take a pause. So I think there's eight different trends that I, as I read and think about it, that are showing up around U.S. food service trends. And one is this idea of meatless or veg-centric focus. So at the New York Produce Show, and actually at London this year also, we had a consulting chef there that talks about this idea of veg-centric. It's not necessarily vegetarian, because they may cook vegetables, say, in a meat broth, but it's veg-centric, where the vegetables really are the starring role on a plate. That's a big focus now. Global cuisine, like they say, ethnic becomes American. American food, there really is no American food anymore. American food is virtually anything that you would find around the world. And what we find is we talk about different cuisines. We used to say, well, let's go out for Mexican food, or let's go out for Chinese. No, let's go out for dim sum. Let's go out for tacos. So it's really moved from an ethnic mindset to a food mindset, if you will.
If I could interrupt you, Tim, this veg-centric idea is really revolutionary. I do some work for the Culinary Institute of America, which has several campuses in America and one in Singapore. And they are really the premier institution for training chefs in the United States. Those chefs, you should know, they would take 2-year courses on how to butcher a cow, and they would take 2 weeks to focus on vegetables. The traditional way chefs determined their menu was what protein were they going to use. And after that decision was made, they then said, okay, what would be a good side dish to go with it? But what we've learned is you cannot increase consumption if what you're going to do is make a serving of a giant steak the center of the plate and just have a little side dish of fruits and vegetables. Instead, you need a totally different way of eating, and say a stir fry is a classic example where protein gets used as a flavoring. And what this movement is about makes a lot of sense. The truth is, proteins tend to be steadily available and of consistent quality. If you're talking about steak or something like that, produce varies dramatically. So this movement is saying, let a chef say, what's fresh, what's wonderful in the marketplace today? Let me make that the focus of what I'm going to do, and then use protein as a kind of flavoring to that item. And this is really a key to dramatically increasing the amount of produce that people eat.
Yeah, and I should add, thank you, Jim. What I should add, this really started in our recession. So we talked this morning in the panel about food waste, right, and imperfect vegetables. There were multiple cuts of meat that we now see on restaurant menus, like a hanger steak, and I don't know where to tell you it comes off the cow, but a hanger steak, for example, was something we didn't see 10 years ago on a menu, and that's one of those cheaper cuts of meat that were being sold starting in the recession as meat prices went up. So this was driven in part because of the recession that we experienced in the United States, this drive towards veg-centric because of the higher cost of protein. In the US, what we're seeing is slowing sales within restaurants. Industry experts would say up to 10% overbuilt in the States. We used to talk about day parts, right? So we used to talk about breakfast, lunch, and dinner and think about how to prepare fruits and vegetables for each of those different day parts. We don't find day parts anymore within the US. What people do is there's really 5 different eating occasions that are identified. And how we're tracking data now within the States is looking at the occasion and the reason for dining out. So from a boys' night out to a family meal to a bachelor party, and it's helping operators understand how to tailor their menus, tailor their service, tailor their environment to those different groups. We talk about there's no distinction between retail or food service from a consumer standpoint. We think in terms of channel retail and food service. Consumers don't think that way. I'm simply eating something that I prepared at home or that was prepared away from home. They don't think in terms of the way we think about it. And then millennials, I think we've got a professor here today talking about millennials and how to work with that generation. Millennials in the States are typically from about 20 years old to 35 or 36 years old. That's what we're calling millennials. They have 59 fewer restaurant visits per year. So when we talk about the opportunities within food service, we're not focusing as much on millennials as perhaps retail or others are, because their eating patterns are very different than ours.
You know, Tim, I have 2 teenage boys, and although they don't really like going out, they prefer, today with such entertainment options in the home, they're not as anxious to leave.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they have apps on their phone, and I don't remember the last time they were in the kitchen, because they want a sandwich, they go on their app and have it delivered to them. So it may be 59 fewer restaurant visits, but I doubt very much it's 59 fewer occasions of purchasing.
You know, that's a great clarification. Very last point I make is around that away from home prepared food. Almost a third of that is not consumed at restaurants, but in other venues, typically at home, for that very reason. Because it's more comfortable, our own environment. You have Netflix, you have any number of entertainment venues you can do at home. You don't have to go out to a restaurant to do that. Interestingly enough, we used to think that innovation was occurring at white tablecloth, at your very fanciest restaurants, your Wolfgang Puck's, your name brand chefs. What we're really seeing now is much of that is being adopted at fast casual. And what we refer to as fast casual, if you're familiar with the Chipotle concept, where you walk up to a counter and they're preparing that for you. One of the newer restaurant concepts in the US is the very quick cooked pizzas, that they make it right in front of you, put it into an oven, and it's done within 5 minutes. Fast casual is where much of that innovation is taking place. So the kale phenomenon is quite a big thing. What, Jim, 3 or 4 years we've seen kale just ubiquitous in the United States. That really started at fast casual. That wasn't an item that came out of a white tablecloth. That's really not a white tablecloth kind of item. That came out of fast casual. You can go to McDonald's today and buy a kale salad, which tells you how broadly that has been adopted. Food with integrity, we talked about that on the panel this morning. Consumers, we've really seen this worldwide phenomenon. They want transparency to where it's being sourced. Is it local? Is it clean? Is it beneficial foods? And then foods that are, we might use the term sustainable, but contribute to personal health, to the planet, and to society more broadly. Very important for for the millennials, but we'll talk about that in another minute, the other demographics it's important to. Meal kits, I was fascinated. I went into one of the Albert Heijn stores on Tuesday and looked at what they do with meal kits, and we're behind where you are in the US. We have Publix and Wegmans, a few other supermarkets that are into meal kits, but when I see Albert Heijn, you can walk in there and buy a refrigerated package to make your tomato soup. It has all the ingredients that you need in there to make a curry dish using cauliflower. Meal kits are growing within the US. 6 to 7% growth is what we see there, and they've got about 13.5% market share. So I mentioned Amazon, as a thread, as you read, Amazon purchased Whole Foods, the natural foods chain within the US with 400 and some...
60 stores.
How many stores?
460.
460 stores within the US. You can buy 75,000 different food items off of Amazon. So they talked about the long tail this morning. That's really the long tail, 75,000 different items. Interestingly enough, you may have heard of Blue Apron or some of the other services that we have in the US that bring you meal kits. They're delivered via UPS or postal service. Less than 30% of households have actually tried those, and 60% of those that did try them canceled within the first year, and half of those within that first 6 months. 47% of consumers actually paused that subscription, so they put it on hold. They still hold their subscription, but they put it on hold. Interestingly enough, these appeal to foodies. The foodies are people that are watching a lot of TV shows, but they're also not interested in cooking more than the average consumer. What they really find the motivator for meal kits is experimentation with new foods, learning how to prepare them. Those meal kits, of course, come with all the items that you're assembling the ingredients, recipe, and instructions on how to do that. That's the primary driver that we see around meal kits, is experimentation, looking at new foods.
Tim, I'm always interested. These trends often cross each other in unpredictable ways. So on the one hand, you have people interested in these things for all the reasons you're saying. On the other hand, we hear all this stuff about food waste, and people are very concerned about that. Well, if you have subscriptions to anything, and then all of a sudden, you get called out on a business trip for a week, or you've been invited to the neighbor's house for a barbecue, or your kids are running late from a sport, and you're going to run through McDonald's, it turns into food waste, these things. So consumers wind up trying these things, but then they get unhappy because, I paid for it and I never used it that week. We have a lot of people who have been involved for years with what we call CSAs, or different box schemes that farmers, CSAs, community supported agriculture, people make a subscription basically to a farmer, so the farmer has a sustainable source of income and knows he'll have a customer, and you take what he grows. Now, it's really fantastic, but people often say, wow, I got this box of rutabaga, and I've actually never done anything with that, and maybe they'll do something with it, but the farmer might grow another box next week and another box, and then you're giving it to your neighbors and you're giving it to whoever you can, and you may get frustrated and say, well, I really don't need that much rutabaga, and maybe this is a wasteful system. So all these trends, they start, they go back, they try, and the whole system, the food system, is in evolution, constantly finding new ways to please people. And nothing is probably the answer, and even if it is the answer, it's just the answer for a little while.
And when we talk about, last slide we talked about sustainability, yet you look at all the packaging, the ice packets and everything else that comes along with these meal kits that are being delivered at home, that's something we haven't heard about, but I think has to show up somewhere in the conversation about that. Versus, like I said, you go to Albert Heijn, it's just a small compact package, very little packaging, and probably recyclable.
Well, Tim, I've never seen anyone calculate it, but someone out there, if they probably has, and if they haven't, they will. you're interested in being sustainable and lower your carbon footprint and all this. Well, how much carbon is burned delivering these things one by one to each house? It's hard to imagine. People are worried about, a very efficient ship with 5,000 containers that comes from New Zealand to London, and if the carbon footprint is like this, one mom in her Range Rover going to a farmer's market to pick up a pound of something is more of a carbon footprint than anything the industry could do.
Labor is a challenge for us, so when we talk about field labor and agriculture, of course, is a challenge, but when we look at food service, we're basically at full employment within the US now, and so average wages in a fast food restaurant, $18,500, a cook, $22,000, kitchen manager, $28,000. That is not sustainable. And you're seeing pressure around the US and various states around a minimum wage pushing towards $15 is going to change that. And then we also have a driver shortage. There's insufficient infrastructure, and drivers don't want to live that lifestyle anymore. There's estimates I've seen that we may see a 50% rise in transportation costs by 2025.
But all these things, once again, are sort of in flux and uncertain. Those wages are unsustainable, and in fact there's lots of articles lately about people working not only in food service but at like Walmart and being on food stamps at the same time, which people say, well, isn't that sort of the public subsidizing these businesses in a sense, because they couldn't have workers if they didn't have a way to live. So on the one hand it has to go up, on the other hand, in some cities like San Francisco, where they have raised minimum wages substantially, there's lots of indication that restaurants close because consumers aren't necessarily willing to pay so much more to get these services. They can do it at home themselves, or have the industry cut things and so within big factories and buy it ready-made at retail. Some things are technologically going to be solved. We already see there have been some interesting things with autonomous cars, but there's also autonomous trucking and things. Coors Beer has a program that they're running now. It's kind of an experiment, but they've ran it several times, where they're taking trucks from Colorado, sending them to California. They use a driver on the local streets to bring them to the highway, put them on the highway. It's basically a straight line, bring them to California, have them met by a driver on the other end for the local drivers. But you could imagine very easily how having autonomous trucks and delivery systems could easily transform the entire produce industry and the local distribution systems.
Yeah. A great segue, Jim, into the next point here around automation. So as we see in the field labor, there's a lot of work going on in agriculture with field labor and reducing that. We see the same thing within kitchens. Robotics for food handling and preparation are being experimented with. You have order kiosks, you have online ordering. The challenge that they talk about here with this automation is, if you've got robotics running that, how do you personalize that experience? How do you feel like you're really kind of in touch with your food and you're getting it the way you want? So one of the ways in which they're addressing the labor issue. And then final point I wanted to mention is takeaway. Delivery at home consumption is growing rapidly, and as I mentioned earlier, almost 1/3 of dinners away from home, prepared away from home, are eaten at home because of cost and comfort.
One of the things about that statistic I should mention, about over 50% of food dollars going for away from home consumption, that involves a lot of things that retailers cannot possibly compete with. Structural changes in society. For example, more people in nursing home facilities, more people in America in prison, more people in universities for longer periods of time. So it's not just a question of consumers changing their habits and, oh, I'd rather eat out than eat at home. Their lives have changed in ways where it's not uncommon today for people to spend 10 or 15 years of their lives, for example, in some kind of assisted living or nursing care facility because people live so much longer. And obviously, if you're in prison, you have no options to decide you're going to go and cook your food today. So, the statistics are interesting and they pose real challenges for retailers in terms of share of stomach.
So some industry data I'll share with you. So restaurants overall, restaurants within the US, 417 billion in sale, they're flat. We see it depending on which segment, whether it's family, whether it's fast casual. Overall restaurant sales though are flat in the US. Out of that 417 billion, 252 billion is what we call limited service and 165 billion would be what we call full service. And basically the distinction between the two is a limited service would be where you pay for your food before you get it. So whether it's at a McDonald's or it's fast casual where you pay for it, you put a number up on your table and they come and deliver it to your table or call your name, that's what we would call a limited service. Full service is where you'd have a sit-down meal, they'd bring you your food and they bring you the tab afterward.
Tim, what percentage of the business actually is it? We tend to think of a chef making decisions there, what I should cook, what recipe I should make, white tablecloths and all this.
Yeah.
What percentage of the business is that kind of business?
So if you're really talking about the upper end, what we would call white tablecloth, it's about 2%. Now if you're looking at what we would call them a chalkboard restaurant, where it's one where they would have a daily special or a weekly special that they're promoting. That's about another 7 or 8%. So to your point, Jim, 90% of those meals or those menus are already fixed on a daily basis. They don't change. And from a supplier standpoint, that's one of the reasons they like the food service business, is because we are very, very consistent with our purchases. Our suppliers can tell you how many kale we're going to need pretty darn close next week and the following week and the following week, not just because they're great at data, but because that's so consistent year after year, week after week.
Although those who are in on food service are grateful for that consistency, many produce producers are not really very competent when it comes to selling to food service. If you want to introduce products to food service, if you want to sell products to food service, they have to be selling those items. They have to be on the menu. So you may have the most delicious peaches in the world and they are the best quality and you're willing to give them the lowest price. You're wasting your time calling the McDonald's buyer, telling them that we got a great deal on peaches this week because McDonald's doesn't sell peaches. Instead, there's a long process of menu development, and produce companies have been doing this. For the first time, items like blueberries from Nature Ripe, cuties from Sun Pacific have been sold through McDonald's, as well as, of course, the items they use in their salads and burgers. But that was not because someone called them up and said, this weekend we have a great deal. And most produce companies are not really equipped to do this. The grower shippers, they don't have development chefs. So there's no one to even talk the language of the food service operator and begin the process of getting on the menu. There's also a problem. It costs money to do these things. There's an investment in developing these things. There are a few companies that have very large market share or are willing to take these chances, but many companies fear, gee, I could develop this whole menu, I could persuade a chain to add it, and then they're going to buy their produce from someone who's a quarter cheaper than I am. So how do I guarantee that I'm going to get a return on investment?
Yeah. And we talked about this morning on the panel about the chef visits that we do every year. And one of the reasons we do that is because it is hard to get feedback from those restaurants about what their needs are. We do a lot of development, product development at the supply standpoint, but it's not because we've gotten great feedback from the operators that said this is what I need, it's because we think we know what they need. And sometimes they need it and want it, and sometimes they don't want it at all. But that's one of the reasons that we do that. Retail food service, so this would be a Wegmans where you go into and get prepared foods. That's about a $62 billion market. That's growing at about 2.8% this year. On-site food service, so Jim talked about this. This would be when you go to the ballpark, when you're at a university, when you're in prison. That's what we would call on-site food service.
Does that include like business and industry?
Business and industry as well as travel. So you're, well, it depends on kind of travel, but we think of on-site food service as where you have a captive audience. So it's
cruise ship?
Cruise ship, that's a captive audience. Prison's obviously a pretty captive audience if we're doing it right.
Google's cafeteria?
Google cafeteria, feed 10,000 people a day. Yep, those are great examples of on-site food service. So total food service market in the US, about $660 billion. Real growth overall, about 2%. And as Jim said, that's comparable to the retail food spend. But because we're spending half of our dollar in food service and half of it at retail, as Jim says, that doesn't reflect half of the consumption of actual fruits and vegetables. At a conventional restaurant, your cost of food runs about 30%. So if it's the plated item sells for 10 euro, it's cost that restaurant about 3 euro for the actual food that goes into it. The rest of it is about a third of its labor, about another third for general overhead. So again, we talk about millennials, 2017, millennials make up 24%, Generation Z, which is that younger generation, makes up 24%. And there's a lot of talk about, and as I said, there'll be a talk here later this morning about the millennial generation. There's a lot of focus around the millennials and appealing to them. But point is, within the US, 52% of our population is age 41% or older. The last of the boomers, I'm a boomer. Jim may have just missed that one. We turned 50 in 2014. It is the largest demographic group in terms of size and percentage of population. So here's how we refer to them. This is the silent generation, born between 28 and 1945. The boomers were the post-war era. Generation X came early 60s, about the Kennedy era, and then millennials about 1980, and now post-millennials or Generation Y, or is that Z, is what we'd call post-millennials. When you talk about millennials, and certainly millennials are where the trends are, and some of the trends are being driven by millennials, but what you also have to do is follow the money. Point is, our population 50 and older has 42% of all after-tax income. Boomers and seniors have 3 times the net worth of younger generations. 75% of the wealth in the US is concentrated in those over age 55. People are the sweet spot of the boomers, if you will, age 55 to 64, outspend the average consumer in virtually every category. Ages 52 to 71, again, our broad boomer category. 55% of CPG sales, consumer packaged goods, right? Boomers outspend our younger generation by 2 to 1. And until the mid-2040s, the 65 and up age group will be larger than those younger generations. So millennials are important, but we can't just focus on those millennials. You've got to look where that money is as well. The point here also is, so I was in junior high when we had our first Earth Day. I think it was 1969 or so.
You're old too.
I am old, yes indeed. And we planted a garden at our school. We dug up a weedy old lot and we planted a garden there. That was the first Earth Day, and it was like Everybody rode their bike to work or walked or took a bus or something else. It was astounding. So we grew up in this idea of the good for the planet idea. We are very focused on the boomer generation. You could say in general, we don't want to get old, we don't want to look old, so we care about fresh, we care about less processed, we care about low calorie, we care about natural, to some degree around organic and local, but those are the same values that you hear talked about with millennials as well. So millennials are not unique in seeking those same values. You see that in the boomer generation as well. Millennials are typically slow adopters of traditional adulthood markers. So you have, they buy cars later, they get married later, they live at home longer, they're college graduates, they're later for their college graduation. They've learned about healthy food and global cuisines online, something we didn't have access to, right, when I was that age. And they have their own definition of good versus bad foods, right? And that's the part of the challenge with millennials is what is good or what is bad. They've each got their own opinion about it. Jim hosted a panel several years ago talking about sustainability. What is sustainability? We each have our kind of own definition around it, and if you ask millennials, that have their own definition around what's sustainability. So this idea of good versus bad food really speaks to millennials having their own idea. Millennials want a brand story, but they're not brand loyal. They're price conscious, they look for local, convenient, digital, and they also don't stock the pantry. Very different than our generation and certainly our grandparents' generation.
When you study these people, there are reasons for many of these differences. Some of them are technological. Get a car later, well, you didn't have Uber either, so
right.
They don't have the same needs. And they don't stock their pantry. They're probably much more mobile, their lives are less predictable. You probably didn't run off to Barcelona because there was a music festival, and their world is just a different world. So it's not just a question of preferences that people have, it's their lives are different, and that leads to different preferences.
And a good example of that, thank you, Jim, a good example of that is college. 50% more millennials go to college than the boomer generation, so that's obviously going to slow down when you would buy, when you'd have money for a car, when you'd want to get married, when you'd want to buy a home and those kind of things. So,
well, even something like college graduation, taking more years to go through college, it's a different student body when it's doubled over what it was 30 years ago. So you'd expect different behaviors.
They earn 20%, again, comes back to the point about following the money. Millennials earn 20% less than boomers at this stage. This to my point about you can't compare a boomer at 25 and a millennial at 25 because those life stages are different. But they do enter the workforce later, they have higher student debt than we had. Here's an interesting statistics. Almost a third of young adults 18 to 34 live at home. They've come back home because they've got student debt or they're not married and it's a way to save up money, and so that's again a lifestyle choice, but partly driven not by choice, but because of debt and other issues.
But also enabled by culture. Parents, kids living at home today are allowed to do things in the home they might not have been allowed to do 30 years ago. So 30 years ago they were more anxious to leave so they could do the things they wanted. Yeah. Now they're able to stay at home and do these same things. And mom still will do the laundry.
That's right. Generation Z, so that's that next generation born in between 95 and 2005. I saw this quote, and I have a grandson that's 3 years old, and I love this quote. This is so true of him. He learned to swipe before he learned to wipe. You know, he taught my wife how to use an iPad, and she taught him the other stuff. you know, the Generation Z was very aware of course, 9/11 that took place in 2001, the recession in 2005 that began in the U.S. They're security conscious, they're recession conscious, concerned about internet privacy more, and they're better at it than the older generation. They're more concerned about it, more aware of it than our generation is, and very socially conscious and resistant to traditional notions on gender and race. They don't see quite the way we might see black and white, or even male versus female. They have kind of very fluid kind of definitions. And what I've read about Generation Z, this may be the group that really points to us to the fact you can no longer take a segment of population and generalize this is what they're like. They're also very, very different because of different influences, different access to information. They may not fit into our traditional mold anymore. And interesting, this should say 75%. 75% of them, because many of them are more savvy, if you will, than their parents. They're involved in decisions, family decisions around what kind of car we're going to buy. They're doing the research and telling their parents what's the better car, which one's got better ratings. They've got influence over home, and they've got influence over meals. So it's changed the family dynamics where no longer it's just mom and dad. It's no longer mom and dad that have all the information or insights. It's the children as well.
Having had children grow up in this age, I remember we were at Disneyland once, and when I was a kid and we would go to Disneyland, and my mom and dad thought it was time we go back, they would tell us, oh, they're going to be closing, in an hour or something, and we have to go. So, well, what can we do? They were going to close. So I have to confess, we tried this on our kids, but it's a different world. And in 2 minutes, he had his iPhone out, and he says, "Great news, Mom! Disney's open till 2 a.m. today." So, the monopoly of information that parents used to have doesn't exist anymore.
That's absolutely right. And then the final point I want to make about this generation is their needs and values and what they like and what they do need to be aligned with a company. So if they feel a company doesn't have the same values that they do, they will abandon that company. So this values-rooted brand differentiation is more important to them than the functional aspects of it or the efficacy of a product. The branded stories of purpose and impact across all platforms are important. When I'm talking about platforms, social media platforms, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, whatever, those are important to Generation Z.
Although I'll add a little caveat, Tim, what we found in sales results and research is that doing good things and being perceived that way is moderately helpful. But being found guilty of doing something bad is really damaging. So you can try and develop a good image and be aligned with the angels in these things, but a lot of it is defense, because what you don't want is that report about how workers in your supply chain are being mistreated or something like that, because you could see sales drop 80%. Same thing on issues like food safety and so forth. Go talk to people at Chipotle about what can happen to a brand when they're suddenly perceived as being less benign as they once were.
Yeah, food with integrity doesn't have integrity, right? So it's a challenge.